Buying land for a tiny home sounds simple, right? Just find a cheap piece of land and park or build your tiny home on it. But hold on, if you don't do your homework, you could end up with land you can't even live on. And that's a costly mistake. In this video, I'm breaking down everything you need to check before buying your land for your tiny home. From zoning laws to hidden costs, I'll share some personal insights I've learned along the way so you don't waste your time or money. Stick around to the end because I'll also go over some of the biggest mistakes that tiny home buyers make when purchasing land so that you can avoid them. All right, first things first, zoning laws. This is the most important thing to check before you buy land for a tiny home. And honestly, it's where a lot of people go wrong. Just because you found a great piece of land doesn't mean that you can legally live on it in a tiny home. Some counties allow tiny homes, others don't. Some require them to be on a foundation, others have like minimum square footage rules, and in some places a tiny home is legally considered an RV, which brings a whole new set of rules. Now, here's where people get confused. Zoning is just one part of the equation. The other part is building codes. And unlike what some people assume, there is no single national building code for tiny homes. Instead, building codes vary by state to state, county by county, and even city by city. There are organizations that create recommended building codes, but these are not federal laws. Instead, states and local governments decide which codes that they want to adopt and enforce. The most common building codes you'll run into are the International Residential Code, which applies to most homes in the U.S. and usually requires a minimum square footage and a permanent foundation. Then there's the International Building Code, the IBC, which is more for commercial structures, and some places apply parts of it to tiny homes. And finally, you've got the National Electrical Code, which covers wiring and safety standards. And let me tell you, that one is strictly enforced just about everywhere. So when you hear about building code requirements, those aren't coming from a single national source. They're coming from whichever version of these codes that your state or county has decided to enforce. Now, here's another key thing to know. There's a big difference between building for yourself and building tiny homes like professionally for others. If you're building a tiny home for yourself on your own land, you may be able to kind of work around things without needing to follow all the commercial builder regulations. Some areas allow owner build exemptions, which means you don't need a licensed contractor. But if you're building tiny homes to sell, rent out, or as a business, that's a whole different story. So many states require builders to follow strict codes, carry liability insurance, and pass inspections. In fact, some states even regulate tiny home builders the same way that they regulate mobile home manufacturers. So what does this mean if you're buying land for a tiny home? It means you can't just assume that it'll be easy. Even if your county allows tiny homes, you still have to follow their building codes. Some places make it nearly impossible to live full-time in a tiny home, while others are more relaxed. That's why, before you buy land, you should always call your county's building and zoning department and ask these three things, okay? Can I legally live in a tiny home on this land? What building codes apply to my home? And do I need any special permits or inspections? I've personally looked at properties that seemed perfect at first glance, only to find out that they had building codes that would have made it impossible for me to actually live there. So before you fall in love with a piece of land, make sure it's legally usable for your tiny home. All right, next up, we're going to talk about utilities, because even if you can legally live there, you still need water, power, a waste system. Let me tell you, this is where a lot of people get caught off guard. Some properties seem like a great deal until you realize how much it'll actually cost just to get basic utilities hooked up. Water access, let's start with water. If your land doesn't have city water, your options are drilling a well, setting up a rainwater catchment system, or hauling in water. And trust me, each of these has its own challenges. A lot of people assume, oh, I'll just drill a well. But wells aren't always cheap, and they're not always guaranteed to hit water. Matter of fact, the national average cost of drilling a well runs between $5,000 and $15,000. And if you're in a rocky area, it can go over $20,000. The final cost depends on how deep they have to drill, your soil conditions, and whether or not you need extra filtration. And here's the kicker. There's no guarantee you'll hit good water. Some wells run dry, and then you're stuck with an expensive hole in the ground. Now, some people try to go with rainwater collection, which can be a great off grid solution. But here's the catch: some states actually restrict or regulate rainwater harvesting. States like Colorado and Nevada have strict laws on how much rainwater that you can collect. And in some places, you even need a permit just to set up a system. So if you're considering rainwater collection, check local laws first, because the last thing you want is to set up a system and then find out it's illegal. Next, let's talk about waste disposal. Even if you go off-grid, you'll still need a plan for handling waste, and a lot of counties won't just let you dig a hole and call it good, you know what I mean? If your property isn't connected to a sewer system, chances are you'll need a septic system. But before you install one, most counties require a PERC test, and that stands for percolation test, to check how well your soil absorbs water. And let me tell you, failing a PERC test can be a big problem. A standard septic system runs $5,000 to $12,000, but if your soil isn't great and you need an advanced system, it can be well over $15,000. And now if you're thinking, I'll just use a composting toilet and skip septic altogether, that's an option. But again, you have to check your local laws, because some areas still require a septic system, even if you're not planning on using it. If you want a higher-end off-grid option, incinerator toilets burn waste into sterile ash using electricity or propane. They cost anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000, but they're completely self-contained, and I'll link to one in the description that I personally recommend. All right, now let's talk about something that people don't always think about: road access and the actual land itself. Because even if you find the perfect spot, and you've got to be able to get to it and actually put a home on it. So first thing, can you even get a tiny home onto the property? If you're buying land that's tucked away off a dirt road somewhere or deep in the woods, how's that delivery truck going to get there with your tiny home? Some properties are so remote that moving a tiny home in would require cutting a whole new road, and that can cost thousands of dollars. Another big one is flood zones. If the land sits in a floodplain, not only do you risk dealing with major water damage, but your insurance rates will be sky high if you choose to have homeowners insurance. And in some places, they won't even let you build there unless you take extra precautions, which that can get really expensive. And then there's the actual land itself. Is it sloped, rocky, full of trees? Clearing trees, grading the land, and prepping it for building is another cost people often overlook. I've seen people buy land thinking it was a steal, right? Because it's so cheap, only to find out later that they had to spend thousands just to make it livable. That's why you need to walk the property before you buy. Don't just rely on Google Maps or satellite images. Walk it yourself. Now let's talk about money, because owning land isn't just about the purchase price. A lot of people assume that land taxes are always low, but that's not necessarily true. Some areas actually have higher taxes on vacant land than on a home. So before you buy, make sure that you check what the property tax rate is in that county, because you don't want any surprises when that tax bill comes due. Now let's talk about financing, because this is another thing that catches people off guard. If you were planning on getting a mortgage for land, I hate to break it to you, but most banks won't finance raw land the way they do houses. Banks see land as a higher risk because, unlike a house, it doesn't generate income. So instead of a traditional mortgage, you're looking at a land loan, and those typically require higher down payments and shorter loan terms. That means bigger monthly payments. And in some cases, banks won't even lend at all unless there's already a house or structure on the land. So if you're planning to finance, talk to your lender up front so you don't waste time looking at properties that you can't even buy. If you can, the best option is to buy land with cash or look for a seller financing deal where the seller agrees to finance the purchase directly instead of going through a bank. I always tell people, don't assume financing will be easy. Look into your options before you get too deep into the process. All right, now for the fun part. Hidden costs and common mistakes that can wreck your budget if you're not prepared. The first hidden cost, land clearing. If you're buying heavily wooded land, you might have to spend thousands just to clear enough space for your tiny home, and if the land isn't level, grading and excavating can cost even more. Then there's the driveway installation. If there's no existing driveway or the road leading in is too rough for a regular vehicle, you might need to build a road just to access your land. That's another cost most people don't think about. And let's not forget surveying and soil tests. Some counties require a land survey before you can even build anything, and that can run anywhere from $500 to $2,000 depending on how much land. And if you need a perk test for a septic system, that's another cost you have to account for. Now let's talk about some common mistakes that tiny home buyers make when purchasing land. Mistake number one is buying land before checking on the zoning laws. I know I already covered this, but I have to repeat it because it happens all the time. People get excited, they find a cheap piece of land, they buy it, and then they realize that they can't legally live there. Do your homework first, okay? Mistake number two is underestimating the cost of utilities. Like I mentioned earlier, bringing in electricity, water, or septic can cost way more than you expect. Always get estimates before you buy. And mistake number three is not considering road access. I've seen people buy land in the middle of nowhere without thinking about how they're actually going to get a tiny home delivered. If a truck can't get there, you've got a problem. Bottom line, don't just look at the price of the land. Look at the total cost to actually make it livable. So before you buy land for a tiny home, make sure to check zoning laws, utilities, road access, property taxes, and hidden costs, because what looks cheap on paper can get real expensive real quick. Now I want to hear from you. What's your biggest concern about buying land for a tiny home? Drop it in the comments and let's talk about it. And if you found this helpful, hit that like button, subscribe for more tiny home tips, and I'll see you in the next video.